Germany has committed to helping Ukraine produce long-range weapons. Chancellor Merz announced the plan after talks with Ukraine's President Zelenskyy earlier today in the German capital. Merz said the weapons would be produced by Ukraine with German assistance, with the move representing, quote, a new form of military-industrial cooperation with Kyiv. Berlin also promised some €5 billion in military support. Now, Merz also said that Germany is in talks with the U.S. about new sanctions on Russia. Zelenskyy called on Ukraine's allies to seize more Russian assets abroad. And both leaders said Russia had shown no appetite for peace talks. Here's more from Chancellor Merz.
Moscow, on the other hand, is playing for time. The position paper for negotiations that President Putin approved over a week ago still has not been shared. The massive aerial attacks, particularly the bombing of Kyiv over recent days, speak the language of an aggressive war of aggression. We will therefore step up our pressure on Russia, and we do so to try to weaken the war machine of Russia, but also to pave the way for negotiations.
So let's turn now to our chief political correspondent, Nina Haase, who was in the Chancellery earlier today for that Merz-Zelenskyy press conference. Nina, tell us how this visit by Zelenskyy is different from the previous trips that he's made here.
Well, this one, Claire, was different because Germany has a new chancellor with a different tone, also when it comes to supporting Ukraine. Friedrich Merz has been in office for 3 weeks now, and he's clearly put a focus on repositioning Germany as a crucial European ally of Ukraine's. And we all remember that he travelled to Kyiv straight away with European partners. And the biggest takeaway from this press conference for me today were two things. One, that Friedrich Merz stressed that the last 3 weeks have showed more efforts by European allies, always in coordination with Donald Trump, to end the war through diplomatic means than we've seen in the last 3 years since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And Merz said that Vladimir Putin is showing that he's not interested in finding a diplomatic solution. So while that is the case, Europe must step up and help Ukraine defend itself. And to the other takeaway, very specifically, there's been a huge shift in just how Germany supports Ukraine, and that is probably something that will go down well with Ukraine's President Zelenskyy. We all remember that Merz's predecessor, Olaf Scholz, was always very reluctant when it came to helping Ukraine get access to long-range weapons, and Merz has now decided to help Ukraine produce those long-range missiles. So Zelenskyy will no longer need foreign approval or supplies to strike targets on Russian territory.
A significant shift, to be sure. We've also learned today that Germany will provide further military support for Ukraine to the tune of about €5 billion. What more can you tell us there?
Well, the defense ministers signed an agreement, the German one and the Ukrainian one, and that agreement says that Ukraine will be able to produce, quote, a significant amount of long-range weapons this year already, and that the Ukrainian army will then be able to use those very soon, within the next few weeks. And they say that it's missiles that Ukraine is already using, so that probably means that we're talking about systems like the French Scalp or the British Storm Shadow. So for now, we're not talking about the state-of-the-art German Taurus system. And then Germany will also continue to help Ukraine get access to more air defense systems and help it, repair some of its weapons that are being used on the battlefield.
So Merz has made exceedingly clear here that he thinks more European support for Ukraine and also for defense more generally is badly needed. But is the German public behind him on this? And then the big question of how he will pay for it all.
Yeah, the $5 billion that were announced today, that is money that's already got the green light from the German parliament. So that is not new money, but budget discussions are ongoing and they are going to be tough. We know that Germany is on its way to agree to the 5% GDP goal that NATO members will probably agree on as a goal for their defense spending. That NATO summit is taking place next month. And of course, Friedrich Merz needs to get the German public behind him because because that is a massive boost of defense spending. And I asked Friedrich Merz where the money for those specific measures to support Ukraine will come from and whether frozen Russian assets may be used as well. And we know that the G7 agreed to use interest from those frozen Russian assets to help Ukraine get access to some 50 billion. But Merz hinted at the possibility that this will again be discussed at the next G7 summit that is happening very soon. So I think he will hope to not have to pay for all of it that is coming up out of German taxpayers' budget, essentially.
Our chief political correspondent, Nina Haase, thank you so much for that update. And let's get the view from Ukraine on all this and turn to our correspondent, Rebecca Ritters. Rebecca, do you think Kyiv will see this trip as a success already?
Yeah, Claire, I think Ukraine's definitely going to be taking this one as a win. As Nina just very concisely pointed out, Friedrich Merz has really changed his rhetoric. That's the German Chancellor since coming into office just a few weeks ago. And certainly, you know, a lot more how should I put it, strong-willed. His tone, his word, his rhetoric, you know, towards Germany's support for Ukraine has been a lot stronger than his predecessor, Olaf Scholz. And that is something that Ukraine is really, really grateful for. It's come at really good time as we've seen the US flip-flopping on their policies towards Ukraine and at times pulling their support, reinstating their support. That, of course, makes Ukraine very, very nervous. And it's looking to its European allies, you know, namely Germany, France and the UK, of course, as well, but particularly Germany. And that's something that today's talk with Friedrich Merz will certainly be, you know, seen here in Ukraine as a win, that these two countries are now moving ever closer.
And when you look at the support from Germany that's just been announced, do you see this as part of a shift in Ukrainian strategy to focus more on building up their own military capabilities and be less reliant on Western aid?
Well, that is a strategy that we have been seeing developing here, Claire. Certainly, you know, the Ukraine still relies heavily on Western allies and Western weapons, of course, and but we are seeing that slowly change. You know, Ukraine becoming more dependent on homegrown, domestic-made weapons, trying to ramp up production. You know, one of the messages, whenever we saw Zelenskyy travel around to his allies asking for support, it was always weapons, weapons, weapons. But oftentimes, you know, by the time the Western allies agreed to give the weapons, it was a little bit too late on the battlefield. So, you know, Ukraine has tried to ramp up its domestic production, and that's why today's agreement will be seen as such a positive here. Also because on the front lines, this is becoming more and more a drone, you know, a war of drones and drone warfare, and a lot of the production of drones happens here in Ukraine now. Of course, Ukraine wanting to develop other weapons, wanting to make more weapons here at home, so it is less reliant on foreign aid. Of course, it will still require financial aid from its allies, but there'll be less delay when it comes to actually being able to apply those weapons on the front line and try to, you know, not have such a lag time between asking for things and being able to deliver.
And when we look at efforts toward a ceasefire, how do you think today's developments might potentially, if at all, move the needle on possible talks with Russia?
Of course, that is difficult to say. It's really hard to predict how Russia's going to react. We have seen some comment since this talk with Merz that Russia coming out to say that this looks like, you know, German support, that Germany getting involved in this war. So how that's going to affect any decision by Putin to attend talks. A few hours ago, though, talks were still on the table. The Kremlin discussing where, hoping for Istanbul to be the place. But, you know, Ukraine, for its part, and now more and more its European allies at least have been saying publicly for a long time that Putin has never really been serious about these talks anyway. So whether or not things are affected by today's outcome in Germany remains to be seen.
Thank you so much for bringing us up to speed there. That is Rebecca Ritters in Kyiv. And let's get some context now from Marina Miron, a military analyst at King's College London. What weapons will Ukraine be able to produce now with this German support? And just give us a sense of how much it could potentially change their capabilities.
Good evening, Claire. Well, it's an interesting question because on the one hand, we all know about the Ukrainian-made Neptune missile. Initially, it was made only for the ship version, but there are now variants both for land and air, and Ukraine has used it quite several times. However, the missile is very expensive, and of course, it can be modified. Producing, for instance, the chassis of the weapon is also expensive, so the different variants are expensive, and I assume that part of the money will go into that sort of missile on the one hand. On the other hand, President Zelenskyy announced in August 24 that Ukraine was working on its own ballistic missile. No more details have been revealed in that regard, and I assume that Ukraine also has difficulties financing such projects, especially given the fact that Russia is targeting different production sites and different players which could be involved in the design of different components of such missiles, because usually engines are made, for instance, by Motor Siege, by Ukrainian Motor Siege. The design is done somewhere else, and therefore it's very difficult to produce anything in those conditions. So one part would be to finance this. The other part would be to also maybe invest into more protection of those facilities responsible for R&D of long-range ballistic and cruise missiles, of course.
And how much do you think this German financing can do, and how significantly would a boost to production change Ukraine's capabilities and its war plans?
Well, in terms of production, it's very difficult for Ukraine to scale production. And one of the sectors where Ukraine is very good at innovation, but not very good at scaling, is drone production. Missile production is even more complex. So we're talking about timelines that cannot be clearly defined, how long it will take to produce a certain amount of missiles. The problem is that even when Ukraine starts producing, it will not be able to outproduce Russia. And this will always create an asymmetry. That being said, of course, long-range weapons, say the Neptune missile, which had a reported range of 280 kilometers, is not a bad thing because it's already adjusted to the weapons that Ukraine has. And the armed forces know how to use this missile. They can modify it based on the use on the battlefield, based on the exigencies of war, and they can, of course, target rare areas, logistical nodes, so make things more complicated for the Russians. But I don't think that it's going to be a strategic shift per se because of all the difficulties, because of constant air bombardment that Ukraine is facing and the shortage of air defenses.
And so more broadly, keeping in mind what you've said about Ukraine being good at innovation, but not necessarily scaling, do you find this shift to more local production and being less reliant on the West a good strategy for Ukraine?
Well, I think it's a much better strategy because the West, and we have to be honest here, has not always kept its promises. And so for the Ukrainian command, planning on something and then not getting it delivered is detrimental. It's better not to plan on anything at all. And I think to a certain extent, if you read the Ukrainian press, the Ukrainians are saying it's better to rely on ourselves. We might not have as much, but at least we know what we have and what we're capable of producing rather than waiting for somebody to send something. And geopolitical shifts, wars in other places always affect deliveries to Ukraine. So for Ukraine to be dependent on the West is a very shaky position, even if the Western countries mean it well and want to support Ukraine, but it's not always possible. Look at the shift within Germany from Olaf Scholz to Friedrich Merz. We see this shift in terms of the use of long-range weapons, but maybe the next chancellor will be exactly the opposite. So Ukraine cannot really count on Western allies to 100%, even if it's meant well, and is supposed to be able to develop its own defense capabilities. Same as Russia right now, it is benefiting because since 2013, since they passed the law on defense import substitution, they have been more or less managing their own supply chain. And yes, they don't have all the components components. They get those components elsewhere through third parties. Their intelligence services are active, but they are more or less self-sufficient. And this is something that Ukraine could definitely benefit from in the long run.
Marina Miron, thank you so much, as always, for sharing your thoughts. It's been great talking to you.
Thank you for having me.
We start here in Berlin. Germany has committed to helping Ukraine produce long-range weapons. German Chancellor Merz today announced the plan after talks with Ukraine's President Zelenskyy here in the German capital. Merz said that the weapons would be produced by Ukraine with German assistance, with the move representing, quote, a new form of military-industrial cooperation with Kyiv. Berlin also promised some 5 billion euros in military support. Merz says that Germany is talking to the United States about new sanctions against Russia. Zelenskyy called on Ukraine's allies to seize more Russian assets abroad. Both leaders said that Russia has shown no appetite for peace talks. Here's more now from the German Chancellor.
Moscow, on the other hand, is playing for time. The position paper for negotiations that President Putin approved over a week ago still has not been shared. The massive aerial attacks, particularly the bombing of Kyiv over recent days, speak the language of an aggressive war of aggression. We will therefore step up our pressure on Russia, and we do so to try to weaken the war machine of Russia, but also to pave the way for negotiations.
And our coverage continues now with Fabrice Pothier. He's the CEO of the international political consultancy firm Rasmussen Global, and he was the director of policy planning at NATO between 2010 and 2016. Fabrice, it's good to have you back on the program. I want to start by asking you about this announcement that Germany will help Ukraine develop new long-range weapons that can hit targets more deeply inside Russian territory. Is this going to be a game changer in this war?
Well, I think game changer, we have seen many of these over the past 3 years, so I will be rather prudent on using this term. But what it is telling, however, are two things. One is it is pretty clear that the only way to counter Russia's missile and drone attacks is to go at the source, to go at the stations and the headquarters where the Russians on Russian territory are stocking them and preparing them to be deployed. So I think that's the right strategy, rather than relying on air defense systems, which are costly and which are depleting. That's one thing. Second, and this is really interesting, is the emergence of a new kind of German model. You have the Danish model, which is about, Danish donation going directly into the Ukrainian defense industrial base. And you start to see the emergence of a German model, which is essentially like bringing together German technology and know-how with Ukrainian companies, merging them or partnering them, and then starting producing important weapon systems like missile and cruise missiles, both on the German territory and potentially in Ukraine. So this, I think, is very interesting, very strategic. The question is, how fast will it be able to produce the systems, the weapon systems that Ukraine needs to defend itself?
And let's stay with this German model for a moment, Fabrice. I mean, we're talking about long-range weapons that will be produced on Ukrainian territory, but they will contain German parts, if I understand that correctly. Is this something then that Russia will view or may view as an escalation by Germany and therefore by NATO?
Well, certainly Russia will want you to think that, and will want German people and politicians to think this is a Russian red line. Russia is painting red lines all over Ukraine. And I think if we had stopped at the first one, we would have not done anything of what we've done in terms of support for Ukraine for the past 3 years. So I would not overthink that. We are already in it by the support, both financially but also militarily, the advice we provide to the Ukrainian military. So I think this is now the next new qualitative step forward to help the Ukrainians be able to hold their territory and defend themselves. So again, I would not buy into the Russian psyops of making us talk about Russian red lines. I will focus more on helping the Ukrainians redraw some real red lines, defensive lines.
Well, there have been a lot of red lines drawn in this conflict. As you are also aware, we've seen a lot coming from Russia. We've also seen some coming from NATO, coming from Germany. And I'm wondering, now that we are so many years into this conflict, are people more relaxed about these red lines, for lack of a better word?
I don't know if, we can say more relaxed. I think there is a clearer sense across Europe, including with the new government in Berlin, that we need to step in, and to step in both qualitatively and quantitatively. Also because the US ambiguity and lack of long-term commitment to Ukraine. So I'm not sure it's about red line. I think it's more about we can't, let Ukraine collapse on its own against Russian pressure. The US is no longer a reliable partner, so we need to step in everything and bring everything we can so the Ukrainians can defend themselves. So I think it's more a bottom-up approach than a kind of big strategic discussion about what are the right or wrong red lines. This was a bit too much the discussion in the past with the Biden administration, especially on the nuclear aspect, which obviously scared both the Biden administration and others, including in Berlin. But I think we are hopefully past that until, again, Vladimir Putin comes again forward with some of his psyop red line, and depending on how we respond to it.
You say we're dealing now with, or we're seeing now, the emergence of a German model when it comes to the production of weapons. Is this German model made possible by the new German Chancellor Friedrich Merz?
I would think so. I think it's pretty clear there is both the speed and the clarity of decision about what needs to be done, and in my view, what was not properly done in the past by Berlin. The paradox is Berlin is the prime European donor, both military and non-military, to Ukraine, and yet it was one of the most reluctant ones. And I think the new chancellor is trying to correct this by being more straightforward and going where Germany can really add to the qualitative and quantitative capacity of Ukraine to defend itself. And missile and cruise missile technology is one of those.
Fabrice Pothier, as always. Fabrice, good talking with you. We appreciate your time and your analysis. Thank you.